Okay. Well, were there any questions I could answer for either of you before we get started? All right. First thing I wanted to point out to you before we actually dig into what we were going to work on today was that there's been a couple of new Rails 4 related resources that have popped up on the internet over the last couple weeks. One of them is a video by Ryan Bates here on his website, Railscasts. Have you guys ever run into this website before? It's fantastic. Go home, go to it tonight, watch every single video that he's ever made. Right? He's up to 415 episodes. A lot of those are free. He does have a subscription thing where if you want to see every episode or when he goes back and redoes old episodes to update them to the latest version of Rails, I think it's like $7 a month or something like that. If the budget can stand it, I would say it's well worth it. But even if you just go through and watch all this free stuff, these are fantastically created videos that show you how to do a ton of different things in Rails, just about anything you might want to know. I have to say, boy, a whole lot of the stuff I've learned about Rails, I've learned or at least figured out because of things I've found in the videos that he creates. Anyway, his latest video is upgrading to Rails 4. So basically, if you have a Rails 3 application and you want to upgrade it to Rails 4, he essentially walks you through the steps in the latest video. So that's one thing I wanted to point out to you. The other thing is Code School has released a series of Rails 4 videos, 9 of them, if I remember correctly. Right? For free, they're out there, high definition, again, very well made. And basically what these do is they go through and they outline for you the things that have changed in Rails 4, the things that are different in Rails 4 versus Rails 3. I went through and watched a couple of them, and they're very interesting. Good stuff. So might want to take a look at those too if you get a chance. Okay? What I promised we would work on today was playing a little bit with AJAX in our Rails application. Here in our To-Dos application is where we could fiddle with this a little bit. Before we dig into that, I just wanted to make sure, are you clear on what AJAX is? No? It's a cleaning product. Okay, it's that too. But AJAX we're talking about here, AJAX, is actually a JavaScript-founded technology, a technique in a way, that can be done using JavaScript. AJAX actually stands for Asynchronous Javascript and XML, which is a little bit of an outdated name because when we use AJAX nowadays, we rarely use XML with it, although that is a possibility, right? But really what it comes down to is just those first two letters, Asynchronous JavaScript, right? What AJAX is kind of all about is the fact that normally page content is synchronously tied to the request-response cycle. Obviously. Okay, maybe not so obviously, right? Essentially, ignoring the fact that AJAX exists, we could say that the only time you see new content on a web page is when the entire page is refreshed, right? When the whole page is re-downloaded. Okay? That's the way most everything on the web works, right? The way it's worked back through history. AJAX, though, changes that. What AJAX lets happen is it allows a page to be loaded, and then while that page is sitting there in your browser, JavaScript inside that page can send out additional requests to a server, get information back from that server, and then dynamically parse that content into the page's structure without the entire page itself having to be reloaded. Right? So imagine a weather website. Right? Instead of having to hit refresh in your browser to update that weather web page to see what the current temperature is, what could happen instead is you load up the current temperature web page and you just let it sit there. You never manually reload it. But while it's sitting there, JavaScript is in the background, maybe once a minute, once every 10 minutes, whatever the schedule. JavaScript is sending out requests to the server saying, what's the temperature now? Well, what is it now? Has it changed from before? What is it now? Right? And then whenever JavaScript gets the temperature back from the server, JavaScript strips the old temperature out of the page, pops the new temperature in. So essentially what we end up with is a page that sort of automatically updates itself as conditions change without us ever having to actually hit refresh. Does that make sense? All right. So essentially AJAX is all about JavaScript is what it comes down to. So why would we want to talk about it in a Rails course? Well, despite the fact that it's founded in JavaScript, the JavaScript has to have somebody on the server to talk to. That's where Rails comes in, right? Now, Rails isn't the only server-side technology that supports AJAX. Generally, any server-side language could be used to put together responses that could be given back to JavaScript when it makes its little asynchronous calls. But in our case, of course, it's Rails that we would be concerned with making it do that sort of thing. All right? Let's see. Do you have any questions? Does that make sense so far? All right. So in our little to-dos app right now, everything at the moment is synchronous. There's no AJAX in it anywhere. If I, for example, say create a new to-do called test2, that'll work, and I hit create to-do, what happens is, of course, the request will be sent to the server. The server will send back a whole new page, an entirely new page with everything on it updated, reflecting the fact that we've added a new to-do, right? And the whole page then gets reloaded. So we have a total page refresh, right? It's almost kind of hard to tell that we had a total page refresh because only one little part of the page changed, right? But overall, that's really what it came down to, was the whole page was actually reloaded. That means, caching aside, images might have had to be re-downloaded, style sheets might have had to be re-downloaded, there might have been multiple requests that actually had to be sent back and forth between the browser and the server. Overall, a time-consuming process. Running here on my local machine, it happened almost instantaneously, which is part of the reason to us it didn't look like it was any big deal. But if we had done that same thing on a 56K modem or some similar type connection, we would have felt the effects of having to completely rebuild the page. With AJAX, overall, the exchange of data would have been much more efficient, right? So that's kind of what we want to work on, is see if we can get those things to kind of change dynamically, right? And it'll be a little bit hard to tell if it's actually happening, but we'll just keep an eye on the logs and make sure everything's actually going through JavaScript, right? So what kind of things might we want to be able to update? Well, we certainly might want the new form to be able to update the to-do list dynamically. Whenever I click an X next to one of my to-do items to mark it as complete, we might want that to update automatically. As a matter of fact, I wonder if maybe that might be the best place to start, to see if we can mark an item off our to-do list and have it show up as a completed to-do through AJAX. Dealing with just a regular old hyperlink, that might be one of the easiest things to start with. So let's give that a shot. Okay. Let me go over to my to-dos index page. Here we go. Here's my actual link that makes the little X that appears next to each one of the to-do items, right, which then submits to the to-do path. Right, passes in the ID for the to-do, right, and it sends it using method put. So essentially we are calling the update method. Right? Right. All right. First thing we'd want to do, if we wanted to do this through AJAX, is instead of having this hyperlink be a regular traditional hyperlink, instead what we would want is we'd want this hyperlink to essentially become a little JavaScript script that, instead of just doing a normal hyperlink behavior, instead sends an asynchronous call to our update path here. Right? We should be able to do that by just adding another parameter on here, remote true. I haven't done this in a while. I hope I'm remembering everything correctly. So remote true. If I go back over to my browser and hit refresh, I'm not seeing any errors. My X's are still showing up. If I click the X next to one of them, nothing happens now though. If I now hit refresh though, then the thing disappears. Did you catch that? If I click the X next to one of my things, before, that thing would immediately move down to the completed list. But if I click the X now, it just sits there. Right? But if I hit refresh, then it moves. Right? What's happening is, since we've updated that X link to become a remote call, to basically become an AJAX call, Whenever I click it, JavaScript is asynchronously, separately from the reloading of the page, sending the request to the server. The request is still being sent, Rails is still seeing it, Rails is still marking the to-do item as being done, right? But because it was done asynchronously, it was separated from the regular reloading of the page. The page didn't reload on its own the way that it normally does. Right? So it wasn't until I manually hit refresh that I actually saw the result of the change. So far things look like they're working pretty well. Okay. That wasn't too hard. Just added remote true to the hyperlink. I wanted to be an AJAX link. Now, up in my controller, right, what we're actually calling is the update right here. Right. Here with the update link, we're telling it that no matter what happens, right, what it should always do is take the ID that it's been passed, update the parameters that go along with it, and then redirect to the to-do's URL, saying the to-do is updated. So basically back to the index page. Okay. What we would want to do is sort of a next step so that we could actually get the completed and the pending to-dos to update without the entire page having to be reloaded, is we would need to teach this update method to tell the difference between a regular hyperlink type request and a AJAX type request. Right? So to do that, we are going to want to take and wrap this entire part of update inside a respond to block. Oh wait, it's respond to do format. Something like that. And then I could tell it here, if the format is HTML, then do that thing we specified before. Redirect. Right? That can be handy because then if somebody had JavaScript turned off in their browser, they wouldn't have the ability to do the asynchronous JavaScript call. So they would basically just fall back to this regular HTML behavior, and for that person who has JavaScript turned off, our to-do application would work just like it was for us previous to this. Right? But for people who do have JavaScript enabled and can do those kinds of calls, what I want to do is I'm going to tell it to also respond to JavaScript format. So I'm going to put in format.js there. All right. Putting in format.js is going to cause Rails to look for a template file, okay, that has the name of this action, update, and the extension, the output type of JavaScript. So over in my to-dos views, I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to call it update.js.erb. Oops, and I misspelled JS. Can you believe that? There, JS. Update.js.erb. Right. Now, this file is called update because it goes along with the update action, so that's what Rails will be looking for. I did the .js because I'm basically telling it we're not going to be outputting HTML here. Instead, what I want to happen here is I want to be able to put in JavaScript code, and then that JavaScript code is what should then be returned back to the client and executed. The .erb on the end means that I can just still use my ERB tags the way that I have before. Right? So just to test this out, I'm going to put in alert. Right? It works. If I go back over to my app, mark one of my to-do items as being complete, look at that. It works. Okay. Now, I think it can be, to me anyway, it seems a little deceptive what actually happened there. Having been through a JavaScript class, you know it's not all that big of a deal to be able to click on a hyperlink and make an alert pop up. That's like first week JavaScript, right? But here, something much, much more complex was actually happening. What actually happened here was that when I clicked my hyperlink, right, what that ended up doing was calling a JavaScript function. That JavaScript function put together an asynchronous call, an AJAX call, that got sent into my update method. Right? The update method retrieved the to-do, right, updated the to-do, and then once the to-do was updated, when it came time to figure out what the response should be, right, it saw that that request came from JavaScript, right? So it came down and used this line format.js. Right? Since I didn't tell it specifically what to do there, I didn't say redirect or anything like that, Rails fell back on its default behavior, which was looking for a file that has the same name as the action, update, and the same type as the format that we received. So JavaScript. Right? So it went out and it found the JavaScript file that I created. Right? But remember, at that point we're executing code on the server. JavaScript can only run on the client. So what actually happened was the content of this JavaScript file was sent, again, asynchronously back to the function that initially sent the request. All of this happening in the background while the page is just sitting there in the browser. Right? So the JavaScript I wrote into my update.js template gets sent back to that function again. That function then sees that it's gotten executable JavaScript code back and executes it. And that's the point where the alert then pops up. What do you think? I'm going to create a few more to-dos here so I have some to keep practicing with. Does it make sense so far? It's kind of complex. A lot of little moving bits and pieces here and there. Okay. Popping up an alert that says it works is probably not what the user expects. Instead, I imagine what the user would like to see when they mark something off their pending to-dos is to have that to-do disappear from that list. Right? So that's kind of step one. And then step two would be making that to-do reappear down in the completed to-dos list. Right? So what I want to do is, instead of showing up an alert, I instead want to change the content of my pending to-dos. Right? There's a lot of potential ways we could do this depending on how granular we wanted to be. Right? We could, for example, potentially have every to-do in this list have an ID of some sort that we could seek out and destroy, so that we could literally just wipe out one particular to-do there with a little bit of JavaScript, so nothing else in that section of the page has to be redrawn, has to be reloaded. Right? That would be a little bit more complicated. Right? An easier thing to do would be just to reload that entire subsection of the page. Just reload that entire list of pending to-dos right there. Right? So let's see what it would take to make that happen. I'm going to go over to my index page again. Right? In my index page, what I have is I have a table called pending, or a table with a class of pending. And that's really what I want JavaScript to update, is to update that little table. To make that a wee bit easier, what I think I might do is I might take that table and I might wrap it inside a div. And I'm going to give the div an ID of pending list, let's say. That just gives me sort of a dedicated container and I know that what I want to do is just change what appears inside pending list, reload the content of the pending list div, essentially. A first step in being able to do that would be in my JavaScript to be able to do something like pending list.html, working on it. Have you guys ever played with Jquery before? In the JavaScript class, we cover basic JavaScript, the JavaScript language itself. Right? That's fine. There's nothing in the world you can't do with just basic JavaScript itself. But basic JavaScript itself sometimes is not the most fun to work with. Right? So lots of places, lots of people, lots of groups have created third-party JavaScript libraries to make JavaScript a bit simpler, a bit easier. Probably the best, maybe not the best, the most common of those is a library called Jquery. Right? Jquery has nice little things in it like being able to grab selectors, basically like you would in CSS. So here, for example, when I say $pound pending list, what that does is it essentially does a get element by ID and automatically retrieves for me the thing that has an ID of pending list. Then the .html method over here will essentially strip out the content of that element and replace it with whatever I tell it to replace it with right here. Right, that would have taken quite a few lines in just basic, pure JavaScript. But in Jquery, it wraps a bunch of things up and makes it a whole lot easier. So let's see what happens. If I come over and I mark one of my to-dos as complete now, the content of that div disappeared and it was replaced by what I said to replace it with, working on it. That's not exactly what we want to appear there. But having the ability to be able to change what appears there is a good first step. Question about that? Is that okay? All right. Now, what I really want to do is instead of replacing the content of that div with the text working on it, instead what I want to do is I want to replace it with an updated copy of that table that's already there. I'll tell you what, I do not want to try to take that table with all of its associated ERB sections and logic and try and turn that into JavaScript code that I can wedge in here. That would not be fun. Okay. So what I might do instead is maybe take all of this and turn it into a partial. If I take the table that shows my pending to-dos, if I cut it out of the index page and make myself a new partial, I'll call it underscore pending to-dos, or I'll call it pending list .html.erb, and then I'll paste in my new content right there, or my old content right there, basically that table. Back over in the index page where I had it, I could now instead say render pending list. So as far as the basic page goes, it shows up and it works just like it did before. But now I've taken the functionality for displaying that pending list and I've moved it off over here into a partial by itself. The benefit of that is that in my JavaScript now, when I want it to send to JavaScript, send to the browser asynchronously a new copy of that pending list, I could put that right here. Essentially, I could put in a set of ERB tags right here. Right. I would still need to be inside quotes, I believe. And I could say render the pending list. I should switch to some different quotes. Right? So instead of replacing the content of that div with working on it, Now we're saying replace the content of the pending list with a new copy of the pending list, basically. Okay. If I come over and I give that a shot, though, didn't work. Nothing updated at all. If I refresh the page, the update action worked. I did get that thing marked off, okay, but it never actually updated what appeared on the page. If I go take a look at my output from my server, we might see a clue in here. There we go. Okay. Internal server error, action view template error, undefined method each for nil. Pending to-dos right there. It didn't recognize. That's not what I was expecting was wrong. Why would it not recognize pending to-dos? I know why. It would be because in our controller, when the index action is called directly, we give it a variable called pending to-dos. But when update is called down here, we do not. We don't provide anything called pending to-dos. So we would need to have that. So let me, down here, whenever the update is successful, put together a list of pending to-dos so that those will be available for re-rendering our pending list. Let me give that another try. If I mark it done, nothing happened. Take a look at the log. Everything actually looks pretty okay right there. No errors. If I refresh, it looks like the update did occur, but I'm not seeing the update that I wanted to happen, and I'm not seeing any errors in the log. That's frustrating, right? That's part of the reason I ran us right into that problem, was because I often run into this. Right? I've spent lots of hours sitting there trying to figure out why that doesn't work. Right? It's not doing what we expect it to do, but at the same time, we're not seeing any indication that anything is actually wrong. Right? The trick is that the error is not occurring in Rails, the error is occurring in JavaScript. Let's see. Let me add some new tests here. There we go. Now I still don't see the error even there. Tough to track down. One way or another, what I'm fairly sure the issue is that this partial that we're rendering has some fairly complex stuff in it. It has HTML tags, it has quoted strings, right? Imagine we took this entire thing and pasted it here inside this set of double quotes. That would not end up being valid, would it? That would end up being a mess of a string, because my double quote here, right, would conflict with some of the double quotes of what's actually being put in there. Things are basically just going to go really bad really fast. Right? So Rails gives us a function just called J, a method called J. What I can do is I can take that rendered table and I can pass it to that J method. Basically what the J method does is it is a shortcut for an older method. I think it was called JavaScript escape, if I remember correctly. And it essentially takes the string that you give it and goes through and escapes all the characters in it to make it safe for JavaScript to be able to consume it, to be able to use it. So if I take my rendered pending list, pass it to J to make it safe, and then take the output from J and send that down the wire to the browser to then get put in place of the HTML of our pending list div. Let's see what happens then. Ah, look at that. Now they disappear. All right, so it seems like that's working fine. Like I said, it's kind of hard to tell the difference between the way we had it working before and the way we have it working now. But what's going on now is that the rest of the page is not updating. It is only that pending list that's being updated every time we mark off one of those. Right? As sort of evidence of that, normally what happened before the AJAX stuff was that when I marked one of these guys as complete, we would immediately see it show up down in the completed to-dos. But if I mark test 1 as being complete, it disappears from pending to-dos, but see that it does not appear down here under completed to-dos because we have not yet told that part of the page how to update itself. If I hit refresh and the whole page reloads, there it is. But it's not handling that part of the page update through the AJAX yet. Okay? What do you think? Okay, how about our completed to-dos list then? If we wanted that part to update, do it basically the same way. I'm going to take my completed list and put it inside a div that has an ID of completed list. I'm going to take the actual table there. I'm going to pull it out and turn it into a partial. There we go. And that's where I'll put the actual table itself. Now this partial is going to require a completed to-dos array. So back over in my to-dos controller, like we did for the index action, down here in update, I'm going to need to provide a list of the completed to-dos. Back in my index page, in place of where I pulled the table out, I can now there instead say render the completed list. And just to check in the browser, looks like my partial's working fine. So the last thing I would need then is in my update.js file, I would need to add a bit of JavaScript in here that would result in the completed list being updated. So I could say for the thing that has an ID of the completed list, we're going to change its HTML. The HTML itself, we're going to get from the J method, so it'll be safe. And we'll get the actual content by rendering the completed list. Just like the line above, essentially. Could have copied and pasted. Back to my browser. If I mark something off now, it worked. It disappeared from the pending. It appeared in the completed. Only those two parts of the page were actually updated. Again, we could kind of finagle ourselves a little demonstration of that. If I type blah there into my new form and I actually reload the page, blah disappears. I go back to my default form. But if I type blah there and then go mark off test 1, blah stays, even though test 1 disappeared from pending and appeared in completed because the whole page itself did not reload. Right? All we did was reload these two little segments of the page. Works back the other direction too. Matter of fact, pretty much anything at this point that goes through our update method is going to work. So if I mark something as urgent, oh, not quite that though. Actually, now that I think about it, these others, we still have to make those links remote, don't we? If I go back to index, oh, actually it would be in our partials now. If I want my urgent links to be remote, I just need to add remote true to them. There we go. If I go to my completed list and I want the X there to mark things as not being complete, I'll mark that one as remote true. Let's see how that works then. I'm just going to put something in my form so we can easily tell if the page is reloading or not. Move something from pending to complete. Move something from complete to pending. Mark something as being urgent. Mark something as not being urgent. Yeah. None of that caused a full page reload. All it did was update my two lists. That's fundamentally it. What do you think? Makes it overall pretty easy. AJAX is way easier to do with Rails than anything else I've ever used before. Okay. Under the hood, Rails is using Jquery to do the fancy AJAX calls, which I guess technically you could do no matter what server-side language you are using. Right? But Rails makes it exceptionally easy in the fact that it lets you just put in this remote true and it basically then figures out everything else for itself. Figures out how to use Jquery just based on that to make a good AJAX call.
Is that hard to use AJAX with a basic handmade website, not known Rails?
Harder than this. Yeah, definitely harder than this. Okay. The other part where Rails really makes it a whole lot simpler than it would be with other things is that respond to block. Right? It's not terribly difficult if just by hand, not necessarily in Rails or using any other particular framework. It wouldn't be hard to say, you know, if something hits this page, if something hits this URL, send back this JavaScript content. That's not that difficult. Right? But to be able to do that and have it still be able to respond to regular HTML requests at the same time, that's a lot trickier. And putting in that respond to block basically takes care of it for us. So that's okay. The only other part that we have here that isn't AJAXified, if you will allow my creation of a new word, right, is the form itself, the new form. Right now, whenever I tell it to create a new to-do with the new form, right? If you actually watch the address bar up at the top, you see it load, the whole page reloads whenever I submit the form. If I want the form itself to also work through AJAX, we can definitely do that. Here's my form itself on the index page. Simple little thing. When I say form for to do, I can add remote true in there, just like I would for a hyperlink. That will automatically be picked up, and this form will be rigged up if JavaScript is available, so that instead of doing a synchronous submission, it will submit asynchronously. Okay. Over in the browser, we give it a little try. I'll say test A. When I hit create to do, nothing appears to happen. If I refresh to reload the page, it did work. The new to-do was created, but because we're submitting that form asynchronously now, it was not automatically accompanied by a full page reload. So it wasn't until we hit refresh that we could see the result of the new to-do being created. Okay. The form itself is actually submitting over here to the create action. So again, what I could do is I could put in a respond to block for the sort of action part of that action, the part that redirects or renders, so that we're still covered if JavaScript isn't available for a client. We could still say format HTML, go ahead and redirect the way you have been. But I could also then put in format.js. In this particular case, the action name we're in is create. So this is going to look for a file called create.js.erb. So we would need to make that file and put the JavaScript in it that we want. We are also going to need the pending to-dos and the completed to-dos, like we had to put down in update. These two. Right? Since I'm about to put those in a third place, what I think I'm going to do instead is I'm going to take those out of update. I'm going to take them out of index. And instead I'm going to create a new method. Right? I'll call it load lists, and I'll put them both there. And then I'm going to use a before filter to load the lists, and I'm going to say do it only for index, create, and update. That way I don't have to load the pending to-dos and the completed to-dos in those three different actions separately. I can just have the before filter do that for me without having to duplicate that code all over the place. Everything looks okay so far. All right. So I need to create a create JavaScript template. So I'll create can't type. Create.js.erb. Just like previously we made update.js.erb. And then I just need to put in here the JavaScript that I need, the JavaScript that I want to execute whenever the create action runs. For the create action, we don't really need to redisplay the completed list. We really only need to display the pending list, because that's what will be changed as a direct result of a new to-do being created. So just like we did over in update, for create, I'll tell it to change the HTML of the thing with an ID of pending list, and to do that by rendering the pending list, making it safe with the J method, handing that off to JavaScript to take care of it. Let's see what happens. If I go to my form now and I do test B and tell it to create the to-do, test B showed up, and you notice that test B is still there in the text field because the text field itself never actually reloaded. When I submitted the form, it happened asynchronously, right? Went through the server, ended up sending back a new copy of the pending list, which was updated, so test B appeared, but the form itself did not submit in a traditional way and was never told to reload, so test B is still sitting there. If I do test C and tell it to create, same thing. Right? Keeping this old to-do, the one that was just created there in the text field, is something some people might consider a feature, a benefit. If we didn't feel that way, if we wanted that to still clear out, right, we could certainly do that. That text field is going to have an ID. It looks like its ID is to-do_description. So in our JavaScript that executes whenever we go through the create action, we could say for the thing whose ID is to-do_description, we want to set its value, I think is the method, to nothing. We'll give that a try. That might make a JavaScript error. Let me try test D. Create. No, that didn't work. Still not seeing any errors. My JavaScript errors just don't want to show up. Wait a minute. Am I looking in the right place? Yeah. Okay, so that's not the method. What is the method? Documentation's always nice. Jquery.com. Jquery has great documentation. Oh, there it is. API documentation. They redesigned. There we go. I want something to do with clearing a text field. The value of a text field. What if I search for value? Oh, probably going to find that all over the place. Way too common of a word. The adder method, I'd wondered about that. The adder method you can use for changing just about any HTML attribute, which is what the value of a text field is, right? You can use it to retrieve a value, but there should also be a version of it that lets us set a value. Is it up there? No, I didn't see it up there. Ah, here we go. Attribute name and value. So instead of doing value there, what if I said adder value, set it to blank? Set the value attribute of the text field called to-do description to blank. Let me try test E. Ah, still didn't work. Test F. Huh. To-do description, description. That was the ID of that. To-do underscore description, DESCRIPTION. Yep. Interesting. What if I said change it to test? Blah. Not happening. Start getting the impression that it's not even running that for some reason. Put an alert in there to make myself feel better. Yeah, done showed up. For some reason I'm just not getting that value to change. Adder's not doing it, value didn't do it. What else? Val. I think that just gets values. Don't know that you can use it to set a value. Well, guess it's worth a try. Ah, that did it. The val method. I thought it was value, but apparently it was just val. Seems to have done the trick. Okay. So I think that's about it. All of our hyperlinks on this page work through AJAX. Our form submits through AJAX. The HTML is still all there, kind of as a backup. So if somebody's on a device or has configured their browser to not use JavaScript, if JavaScript's not available essentially, then everything should still work just the way it did before. As a matter of fact, we could go run our tests. The tests aren't paying attention to the JavaScript at all. They're just running things the old-fashioned way, and they still all pass. So it's proof positive that even without AJAX, everything will still work the way it did before. Update to-do app to use AJAX, done. Teach Rails class 9 days ago, yeah, I did that. There, everything's off my to-do list. I think we're finished. Unless there's questions I can answer for you. And AJAX stuff is fun to play with. Can do some neat stuff. Entire websites, lots of content, lots of functionality. Could be boiled down to just a single page sometimes that never reloads. That's actually something that Rails 4 tries to do for you semi-automatically.
Isn't eBay done on Rails?
I don't know. I don't know about eBay.
I remember you saying last week some huge...
Twitter.
Which one?
Twitter is done on Rails.
Well, there's some huge retailer who uses Rails. I know Groupon uses Rails, but that's not really a retailer.
Yeah.
It's just...
I don't know. I can't remember who I would have mentioned. Huh. Short memory, I guess. Last week I knew. I was probably really excited about it, and now it's completely gone. Rural America Internet Learning Site. Rails.org. RubyOnRails.org. They usually have a thing out here that lists some different places that use it.
Isn't Twitter moving away from Rails?
They kind of are using, from what I understand, something that's a bit of a hybrid now. They still use, I think, the fundamental framework of Rails, but parts of it they've had to swap out for other parts that are a little more high performance. Yeah. Luminosity. Train your brain. Yeah. All right, guys. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for being here. Hope it was an interesting class. Hope if I'm lucky, I'll get to see you again in another class in the future.